Hi there, this is Patrick from Platform Services. Today we're going to be talking about CPU and memory utilization and what your team can do as a general guideline to improve and tune your utilization with your resources. So here's an example node. A node is just a host that runs workloads, and in our case, the workloads are pods that are either production workloads, test workloads, and even development workloads. So you can see here that there's a few different workloads taking different chunks out of that pie as far as CPU is concerned. Another thing to note is that the CPU available is what your resource limits are based off of. So when you set a resource limit, such as a CPU limit and or a memory limit, it is only able to grab the resources from the node that that pod exists on. And that's an important distinction to make. Taking a look into these pods, we can see that some of them have quite a difference between the CPU request and the actual consumption. CPU request can also be thought of as a reservation. This is the amount of the resources you've taken out of that chunk of the pie. As far as the actual consumption, it can be quite a bit different, and this is actually something that we do see in the production cluster. When it comes to tuning your resources, one thing to keep in mind is that you should tune them based on the normal operation of the pod, and that is very dependent on your application. Some applications are normally operated during business hours, and they should be based off of those numbers. Other applications are 24/7 and critical in nature, and so you might want to tune them slightly differently. As a general guideline, when it comes to setting your resource limits, they should be at least 40% more than your normal utilization. So when it comes to finding your base resource utilization, that's going to be a challenge for new teams as they have not had pods run long enough to get a good figure. One thing that we suggest as a guideline is to set a high watermark for your CPU and memory requests based off of what you already know. So if you've run your pods for a couple hours, maybe triple the highest amount for CPU and memory and set that as your request, and then set your limits to be 40% more than that. Taking a look at some established pods, for example, this is a hypothetical DevOps production pod. We know that this is the typical pattern. We can make a finer tuning by finding the median of the CPU allocation. This would be exactly the same for memory allocation, and then doubling or tripling that. And as a guideline, we suggest teams to start off by tripling the median to what you would need. In our case, we're actually just doing utter doubling. We're doing about 1.5 because this is a well-established pod. Another thing to keep in account is the normal operation. The DevOps normal operation is during daytime hours. We do not see a significant spike or usage of CPU during outside those hours. And so we don't take in those numbers as significant when drawing the median. You'll notice that the CPU limit is higher than the highest spike in the application, and the CPU request is slightly lower than that. And again, that's because we are very aware of how this application works and are comfortable with setting these limits. Let's take a look at another example. This is a wildfire services pod. Now this application is definitely more critical than the Dev Hub, and time is of the essence when it comes to responding to wildfires. Another thing to note is that the normal operation for this pod is 24/7, so all the numbers in the figure are significant. So again, we can find the median of the figures, and then in this case, we are setting a CPU request that's double, but more importantly, setting it higher than the highest maximum. And again, this is because it's a critical application. We don't want to experience any slowdowns during normal operation. And again, the limits are set to be about 40% higher than that. Thanks again. This is Patrick from Platform Services, and we'll see you soon.